Yeah, release date will be May the 4th, right, Tin?
Agree with you.
The last thing I left behind in my parents' home before they sold it was a full-scale, semi-nude body cast of me.
What are we missing about our soundscapes? How do we identify and experience blind spots in our considerations of the sonic environment? In many ways, sound artists can lead the way, providing us with new tools and perspectives to make sure that we don't miss things when experiencing and researching natural environments. Hello and welcome to The Rest is Just Noise, a monthly podcast all about the science, beauty, and noise of our cities. I'm Andrew. I'm an acoustician and a soundscape researcher, joined by my co-hosts.
I'm Francisco. I'm an architect and a soundscape researcher.
I'm Tin. I'm an architect and an urban planner and a soundscape researcher.
In this episode, we're speaking with Linda O'Keefe, a sound artist and head of the School of Art at Edinburgh College of Art. Her work focuses on the intersection of science and technology, ethics and communication. Her work on gender inclusion in the sonic arts has led to the development of the organization Women in Sound, Women on Sound, whose goal is to make visible women who work in the multitudinous areas of sound, from music technology to sound art, sound in society, the politics of sound, and every area in between. Today, we'll talk with Linda about her journey in sound, her research on the underexamined cultural and acoustic impacts of renewable energy sources, and her latest album, titled Silent Spring, which focuses on the new sounds associated with renewable energy. The rest is just noise. Linda, thanks so much for joining us.
I thank you very much for asking me to speak.
Yeah, we're very happy for you to have come on. So we're going to be getting into quite a few different topics. We're going to be walking through some of your recent research and some of your compositions. But we want to start with the same question that we've asked everyone who comes on, which is that everyone who comes into sort of an academic study of sound and acoustics seems to come from a different path. So what brought you into sound? What brought you into studying acoustic and sound and that sort of stuff?
Okay, I'm not quite sure how far back you want me to go here. It could be from the age of 8 when my father bought me my first Casio keyboard, Casio synthesizer. And they thought that they saw the early inclinations for musicianship, but I wasn't interested in music. I was interested in sound. When I got this first keyboard, I started experimenting with the different sounds that it could make. So playing with all of the little sliders, and this is in the early 80s, so you can imagine the kind of Casio keyboard it is. Mm-hmm. So playing with all of the little sliders and buttons and presets and mixing sound. And again, unfortunately, the idea from my family was that, oh gosh, this girl wants to play piano. And so for the following 7 years, they sent me to different kinds of piano lessons, which was just a terrible, terrible failure. I never managed to learn how to play the piano. I did vaguely learn how to read notes, but I was just always interested in sound. I wanted to explore this thing that you could manipulate, what it is that you hear. But I also loved art. I loved poetry. I was quite a creative person. So when I started to think about going down an artistic strand in education, the obvious place for me seemed to be art school. And so I focused on what is expected of you to get into art school with drawing and painting and making 3D things. But about 1.5 years into art school, I was introduced to an audio engineer in the radio department within my art school in Dublin. And then it was like, a recording studio. And of course, I handily married a musician who played keyboards and synthesizers. I was like, okay, so I've got access to a recording studio. I have this amazing synthesizer that he has where I can play sound backwards. I can record my voice and link my voice to notes, and then I can record. So I started to see the potential of sound as a form of art making, and in some cases visual art making. Now, of course, again, this is in the late 90s in Ireland, and no one knows what sound art is. So I'm listening to the likes of Philip Glass, I'm listening to John Cage, because I don't know where else to look for someone who is playing with sound in a visual art aesthetic way, because this is also the very early days of the internet. So no one is putting their websites up yet, you know. So it's just Philip Glass's the glass house, the glass something was online, and this was this interactive space where you could play with his sounds and hear them in different ways, and that just blew my mind. So there I am. I'm training to be a sculptor, but I'm working with sound. I'm trying to think about how it can be in a visual place where someone can interact with it and be surrounded by it, and somehow see something and feel something. So, you know, I was the first in my university to get a computer, a laptop. I bought a laptop so I could have more control over the sound. Because I didn't feel with the keyboard and in the recording studio that I had control over what I was doing with the sound. I wanted to get in at it, edit it essentially. So I got my first Sony laptop, and it cost the earth, right? It cost a fortune. I couldn't afford it. I actually had to get it on the electricity bill so I could pay it every month. So there I am. I have this amazing laptop. And then what do I do with this? And the guy, the audio engineer, was like, well, you need something called software. And I'm like, oh my God, I've just spent £3,000
on hardware.
On hardware, and I've got to buy something called software. You know? So again, you know, I'm an art student with, you know, very little income, and he's kind of like, all right, okay, so I'm gonna give you Sony SoundForge. I'm going to give you, so he just gave me a whole load of random software, things that would allow me to create loops, to actually compose music with. I think he gave me a very early version of Sibelius. And I still didn't have anything like multi-track audio editing software. So that was still a few years away.
Yeah.
But I started, so that's, I mean, that probably seems like a long journey, but that's how I got into it in art school. But if you want me to continue and how it sort of went to other subject areas.
Yeah,
well,
please.
I was going to say, where have you sort of, how has it brought you to where you've ended up now?
Yeah, so pretty much by the time I finished art school, it was sort of, I had gotten to know a little bit of technology and a little bit about sound, but I was still completely in the dark about this medium in relation to how it was used in other fields, or even still how it was used in the arts. I still felt very alone. At the time I called myself a sound sculptor because I trained in sculpture and I was working with sound as a medium.
Did the term sound art sort of exist at all at the time? Or
I hadn't heard of it at that point.
Yeah.
It did exist, of course, and it had existed at least since the 80s, when it was actually defined in a German sound art exhibition in the 80s. But as a word, it hadn't really spread perhaps beyond Germany and the US at that time. And again, you know, the internet really hasn't proliferated at this point. There's still very few websites, you know. So no, I hadn't heard of the term sound art at that point. So I decided I wasn't finished. I went on to do an MA in virtual realities because I started to think, well, you know, maybe the sonic experience is a virtual experience. Maybe when you build it in a digital space and then you take it out of the digital space and put it in a real world and you can't see it, there is something virtual about it. And I started to work in also 3D software, looking at creating exhibitions and installations in 3D software because nobody was exhibiting sound. You know, if you said to somebody, well, I have a work of sound, most people were just looking at you funny. So I thought, well, maybe I can build these virtual worlds and you can go into my exhibition and hear my work in these spaces. So when I finished my MA, I spent about 5 years trying to hone my practice and what it was. And again, not having an understanding of what sound art yet was. I felt slightly both lost in defining myself as an artist because it was very hard to get exhibitions in this medium, but also incredibly expansive. Because I worked in sound, I would get people saying, could you do sound design for dance? And I'm like, yeah, okay, I work with sound, of course. Can you make a sound work for radio? Yep, of course. It's sound and it goes on radio, so why not? And so on. I worked, in theater, and then it was kind of like people were saying, well, could you do performance? That was an area I really didn't want to get into because I didn't consider myself a musician. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, that's what performance is. It's being a musician. But I thought I can't get into a gallery. So the only way I can reach an audience is to bring my artwork into that space. So then I had to consider the work differently, because a performance is this particular block of time where someone is sitting and listening to your work from beginning to end, rather than an installation where someone can come in and get lost in parts of it and leave at any point, and it will just continuously play. So I had to reconfigure my work as fixed duration. So that was, another transformation of my thinking about sound. So 5 years were kind of spent interrogating that, and in that time I went over to work with sound artist Eric Leonardson. I worked with him as a mentee. I asked him to be my mentor. I'd met him years ago in Canada for the New Adventures and Sound Art Festival, and I got some funding from the Irish Arts Council to spend 2 years refining my practice, and part of that was finding a mentor. And he had so impressed me, and I saw in him the potential of what sound art was. So I went over to work in Chicago with him for several months. And that's when I started to think about sound conceptually. So before I was looking at it materially, as a material form that I was manipulating. But while I was in Chicago, I started listening to that city. I started hearing things I didn't quite understand. I started hearing race. I started hearing segregation. I started to hear unemployment. I started to hear wealth. I started to pay attention to social sounds in the city and how they are shaped by things like the construction of place, the design of a place. So how you build your buildings and plan out your city and place your population creates a kind of a soundscape. Now, at the time, go ahead.
Could you give sort of an example of that? What was it that sort of made you think of that as hearing segregation or hearing unemployment?
Yeah. So when I first moved over to Chicago, we were living on the south side, which is a predominantly African American part of the city. In fact, in its entirety, is practically totally African American population, and quite a lot of areas really poorly developed, housing estates sitting right on large motorways or roadways, very few parks, very few public spaces, a lot of kind of scrubland or abandoned industrial projects, and really hard to get out of that city to get somewhere else. The buses were not regular, and then a couple of months in, we moved to the north side of the city. There was an issue with where we're staying. And suddenly I'm in this really middle to upper class area, large housing complexes, lots of little green spaces, fancy shops, small streets. It just seemed like it was catering to a kind of a quietness, space to breathe, space to listen, space to hear. And I also started to, hear a lot of battle cries on the ground. There was a lot of violence. It was the same year that Barack Obama was voted in. So we were in Chicago at that time. And so I'm talking about it.
Rings a bell, anyone?
I'm talking about it well now. I didn't understand what I was hearing at the time.
Yeah.
I couldn't articulate that experience. I was hearing it. It seemed, sound seemed important, and it seemed important to take note of. I also remember going to the annual powwow, the annual Chicago powwow, which was inside a football stadium. And I was doing that. I was working at a radio station at the time in Chicago, and I wanted to record this experience. And it was a beautiful soundscape. There was amazing drumming and talking and sharing and singing. And it was in a football stadium. This was their sacred space. This is what they had left in the city to have their powwow.
Yeah.
So I came back from that and I wanted to look at this further. I didn't know how to do that because I didn't have the understanding about society, about the politics of place and space, about how we design cities to create these divisions. And so a friend advised me that I might want to look at doing a PhD in social theory. She said, some of your questions would be answered this way. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, the 2008 crash has just begun. There's no work. There's no money left in the arts. I have this big question. I have these big ideas. What am I going to do for the next 4 years while the world is in cycling down the toilet? So I was kind of, well, okay, I can spend the next 4 years looking at this question of sound through sound.
Yeah. I absolutely cannot empathize with that. Doing a PhD while the world is in crisis. Who would do that?
That's it, exactly. So that's how I came to start to examine sound in that way. So I developed methodologies that were about listening and looking at sound and then talking about sound with different groups of people. Now, I did this in Ireland and I focused on a place I knew in Ireland. And so my research is still focused on the same kind of questions I've been looking at in the US, but we're more focused on class. And class is a significant thing in Ireland, the segregation of classes, of people, of thinking about where the working classes should be, and new classes that were emerging within Dublin at the time. So this is 2009, but it's also at the tail end of our economic boom, and the fallout from that highlighting how class divisions had actually been huge in Ireland, and after the crash, what the result of that meant to different communities.
Yeah. Linda, can I just say, because so that's the work about Smithfield, right? And in that chapter and in your PhD work, you mentioned this concept about soundscape gentrification. Yeah. So I think that, it describes the thing perfectly. So how would you define that, and how do you think the communities you were working with understood that? Yeah.
So in the Smithfield area, just to just give you a little bit of a summary about the space. It's a space I've known my whole life. My grandmother was actually from that area prior to being ex-urbanized. So this was a term that emerged in the 90s where the term emerged in the 90s, but it was going on since the 50s, where city planners in the Dublin Council decided that they were going to rejuvenate or regenerate, or all of those fabulous words, the inner city, and to redefine what the inner city was. So it's kind of a case of going, okay, it's going to be for a different kind of populace. We're going to have different kinds of businesses in the city. We want different kinds of people in the city connected to those businesses. But Smithfield had for centuries been a market area in the middle of Dublin city. So really from the 1700s on, it had been a market space where there was a real connection to the rural community. So you'd bring in cows and sheep and chickens into this area. Maybe they were slaughtered there. Maybe they were sent out to be sent around the world down at the docks. But also there was a whiskey distillery in there. There was tanners. So it was this market area where people had been living there generationally. Yeah. And, you had a job and then your children had that same job or relatively similar jobs. And then in the 1950s, as I said, they started to look at changing that part of the city. It had become slightly destitute at that point and wasn't as significant a market space as it had been prior to that point. But rather than thinking about reinvesting in the market space in the city and in that community, it was decided that the inner city communities would be sent out to new suburban housing tracts. so that they would be rehoused and that they would turn that part of the city in particular into a combination of tourist, upper, kind of high class business district, fancy hotels, art house theaters and cinemas and so on. So we're going to transform this area into this kind of space and get the older community out. All right. So talking with the older community, which I did, I interviewed the older community who had lived there from the 50s, both who still lived there or lived outside of the city, about their memories of the soundscape then, and then talking to a younger generation of folks living there at that time about the soundscape as it is now. I started to note this distinct difference between a soundscape that was filled with the sound of community, of economy, of culture, versus a soundscape that was in effect quite silent of all of those things, because it was a city that was catering to, I'm trying to think of the word, passers through, right? People who are coming in to go to the restaurant and then leaving, coming in to go to the art house cinema and then leaving, tourists who are coming in to stay in the hotels, go into Dublin City and then leave. So there wasn't a sense of permanency or community being developed or maintained in this space. So you're removing that working class soundscape and replacing it with this kind of ephemeral business class tourist soundscape that doesn't build a sound that will evolve or change or become something that you grow used to over time.
So we actually spoke last month about we were sort of introduced to this topic about sonic appropriation, just these communities re-exerting their control over that sonic environment. It sounds to me like those are sort of like two competing sides of exerting control over that sonic environment. Do you think, it reminded me of when you were talking about the Chicago Stadium as well. That sounded like that community re-exerting its control over something which had been taken from them. Did that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I mean, I was taking my theoretical perspective from De Soto's production of place, and thinking about how communities take control over their soundscape, how they do that, because the thing about a city is that you have this kind of top-down planned perspective of how it will be designed and how it will be used. So it's not even simply, right, we'll build these buildings, but it's also how we expect you to navigate and move through and engage with the place that we design. And I was very interested to see, well, how from the bottom up do communities take back control of place using sound as a tool to do that? And I guess in certain ways, since the 40s and 50s, there's always been this battle within that particular area anyway, of control over place. And it's about who brings their voice into a place, whether it's a cultural soundscape, something that happens cyclically. So for example, every year they would have the May parade. So this is a religious festival where people would go through the area and sing, and children would come in through and sing. But every Sunday, you would have groups of people who would actually walk through the area singing songs, and then folks would throw down money from balconies at the singers, right? And then you had teenagers who would occupy street corners or parts of a laneway, and that was a place that they always were, but it was a battle. You talked to the teenagers, you talked to the older folks, it was always a battle, to being pushed out, whether it was by the law, whether it was by putting spikes on the edges of pathways so they wouldn't skateboard. There was this battle all of the time for controlling place through sound and presence. So yeah, there is a kind of a backwards and forwards. And because I started the research in 2009, at the beginning of the economic crash, a lot of what they had turned that space into was going then into a downturn. So the community is kind of going, well, how do we get back into the place and take control? And of course, the young people and the older people are the first to get out there and start occupying this place. But at the same time, because there's been a massive loss of employment for that community, you had a growing presence of addicts, for example, going into places that were no longer occupied by tourists. And so that soundscape starts to emerge, which is quite scary and threatening for the community that have been there. So, it's a constant battle when you redesign a place, who gets to occupy it and how that happens with sound.
Yeah. So you've worked a lot with different communities, generating sounds, contributing to the soundscapes of public spaces in cities. But yeah, I mean, public spaces are clearly not just about paved areas, shrubbery, and facades. Public spaces are kind of also happening outside of cities. And it reminds me actually of a lecture while I was doing my architecture studies. A professor showed a slide of a small church in a cultivated Mediterranean landscape, which was, and then he said, like, this is architecture. And he was clearly not thinking about the little church, but the whole of this cultivated landscape that is very much similar to the one existing in Spain, in Terra Alta, where you also worked. And it's about this symbiosis between nature and people going there over the centuries. So, yeah, this just kind of led me to this other piece of your work that's not related to cities, but it's still related to soundscape created by these communities. So could you tell us about your experience in Terra Alta and what led you there?
Yeah. Again, it's where's the starting point? My family has a home in the village in Terra Alta, and I start going there in 2007, just as a tourist, essentially. Really, really rural, very remote village, and beautiful. And it's got its history written into its architecture. There's all these layers. You look at the buildings, and if a garage door is open, you can see this old archway close to the ground of something that was built underneath the building, and then these buildings have been built on top of these old buildings, and the way they're preserved is just they're built into the new architecture. So it has this this history of just building on top and preserving in that way. And it also had a lot of kind of old agricultural traditions. So you would go into someone's, again, garage, and they would have a room filled with different kinds of liqueurs or wines or olive oil that they'd been pressing. So it's sort of, they farm their lands, they might sell out more globally, but they also sell locally. So there's a kind of a local continuity of traditional practices of agricultural economy. But also other kinds of, there was a guy who was the leather maker fixer guy. And so I was getting to know this place for the few years prior to really going in to investigate the place. So in about 2014, I traveled over with a friend, and I started to notice an emerging new technology within the landscape, which was wind turbines. And of course, we're in this period of time where you're absolutely for renewable energy and renewable energy technologies. And it's kind of like, oh, this is really interesting that this is now a feature in the landscape. I like it. I'm positive about it. It's not particularly pretty, but it's a good thing. The following year, I come back and it's gone from being a few dozen to being a few hundred. I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is really pervasive. This is everywhere now. And I can't go into the landscape where I would go and not hear them. Yes, I'm hearing them everywhere. I'm hearing the wind turbines everywhere. And the sound of them as they're blowing, it circulates out quite a bit, quite a ways. Yeah, 200 meters away, 300 meters away, I'm still hearing it. And then maybe I stop hearing it, but then I start hearing the next one. So it's slightly everywhere. And again, I'm kind of going, okay, this is interesting. I'm just going to start recording these sounds because it's this new technology. It's now becoming part of the soundscape. I want to hear it in relation to the natural ecology. I want to hear how they are connecting with each other. So there is this initial aesthetic response to it and thinking about that relationship of a new sound emerging in this natural ecology. The following year, I come back and I had thought in the previous year there was a lot of wind turbines. The following year, I come back and I cannot do a 360. And my village is on the top of a mountain, so the view is 360 for this vast landscape. I cannot anywhere anymore see a horizon without the wind turbines for as far as I can see. And then I start to see some new things in the village. The roads are getting fixed, the pool has been redone, some of the buildings are getting tight, and I'm starting to talk to friends there who are going, oh yeah, we got subsidies to take in more wind turbines, so and this is what they promised, they're doing this, they're fixing up the village, it's great. And then a friend of mine is telling me, well, actually they're also paying subsidies to a lot of the farmers to put the wind turbines in their fields. I'm kind of going, okay, that's good, but the wind turbines now are in every field, and the fields are quite close to the village, so it's coming closer and closer to the village, you know. And the following year, I come back and I'm quite concerned, and I bring a group of people with me on an acoustic ecology residency so we can explore this and start to record the landscape and talk about it. And that was in 2017. I had this really interesting residency with a group of folks I brought over. We did field recording I was already there 10 days recording, and they came over for another 9 days to do field recording. And we met up with the Sound Art Collective in the region who invited us to do a performance in the next local village and talk about our work and what we were doing and what we were paying attention to. And that was really insightful because we got a lot of conversation from people going, yeah, no one is paying attention to how noisy it is now out there. It's really noisy, it's very loud, and it's everywhere. And we're really glad you're coming to record this and maybe speak about it. So 2 years later, I came, or it might have been the following year, I came back and I started to talk again to friends in the village. And I was told then, actually, sorry, this might have been last year. My friend said that the government had come and asked again, could they build more turbines? And the local community went, no, that's it, you have to stop. This is ridiculous that our environment is just a metal sea of wind turbines. It's everywhere. It's noisy, you know. And so last year they basically said, no, we're not taking any more. But along that journey of seeing this huge emergence of this energy tool within the landscape, I was documenting also a changing soundscape of cultural traditional practices. So again, something I've been listening to since 2007, you know, community events during the summer, they had the August festivals and the July festivals and all these kinds of festivals. And I was noticing that there was a lack of people. There just seemed to be less and less people each year, less young people participating in the festivals. There was a lot of houses for sale. And I was hearing again through conversations with locals that there was a bit of money now from the wind turbines. There wasn't really any need to do so much farming. There wasn't that much work to offer people. And so always in a family in those villages, there is one or two who will take over the land and the rest will go off and get jobs elsewhere or go to university, or, they don't want to work the land. They want to get out of a rural village. But now there was no work for anybody in the family. It was a concern that was like, well, we're getting money. So I started to think about, well, what's going to be lost here?
Well, so why wasn't that treated as a sort of supplementary income? They were getting the money from allowing the turbines on their land.
Yeah.
Why did that take away from the farming?
Well, because the cost of produce selling from Spain has dropped radically in the last few years. So, for example, the selling of olive oil and olives and almonds, which is kind of a big part of what they produce there, it's the sale price has dropped dramatically in competition, especially with produce coming out of the US. So in fact, they're not getting a lot of money for what's produced on the land anymore. And there's currently talk of moving to a more large-scale farming processes similar to what they have in the Midwest in the US. So moving away from the old traditional farming practices, but also getting rid of the old olive trees and putting in new, higher yield olive trees to produce greater amounts of oil and olives and so on.
So would that have happened with or without the turbines?
To be honest with you, I don't know. I think it's more that a lot of what they also produced on the land was about sustaining community. It was also part of, we grow our own food, we grow and sell locally. We have practices that we pass on to our kids and so on. So, I don't know. It's probably alongside it. Nothing happens in isolation. There are kind of, you always have to look at the multiple factors that influence these things. But from my perspective, that new infrastructure was one of the factors.
Yeah.
Definitely one of the factors. Yeah.
So my first job in acoustics was actually carrying out noise surveys for wind farms in the UK. So I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about the sound from them and spending a lot of time around them and very close to them. And all of our regulations and goals here were focused around reducing the noise impact to humans. Some of the things that you've talked about of, that now they have this 360-degree view of just metal and noise coming in. But what sort of lessons should we take about how these sorts of renewable energies, which we're seeing more and more of and tend to be taken, particularly from people like us who are like environmentalists who care about, more sustainable energy production? What sort of lessons should we take about how these renewable energies impact the natural environment? And what are we missing by only focusing on their impact on humans?
Well, I mean, one of the things I was doing when I was recording there as well was listening to the crickets and the mosquitoes and the cicadas. And so this is going to be a two-parter answer. And the second part, I think, is going to be a little bit controversial. So we'll get to that in a second. So in listening to the natural world, I started to, I was kind of looking at this anthrophony through I won't use the word lens because that's again slightly problematic, but through the ears of Bernie Krause and thinking about paying attention to a transformed soundscape over time when you introduce something different to the environment. So I decided to focus on listening to the cicadas. And my first recordings, my early recordings there were of how you interact with the space and the cicadas interact with you. So you start walking through the woods and the forests. And the minute you step on a twig or crunch a stone or whatever, they go silent. They send this message, which is like a really loud burst of sound, and then go quiet. And the next group will go quiet because they're basically warning each other there's possibly a predator coming through. So everybody shut up. Then as a field recordist, you got to sit really quiet and get silent. And then you get to record them again as they start to squeak again, all right? So then the wind turbines come in and I start thinking about, well, how does this, how is the relationship between this technology and the cicadas working? And And over time, and again, there's a few years of recording here, but towards the end, my final listening experience was that I would drive up to an area where a wind turbine was. I'd get out of the car, I'd set up my gear, I'd be making noise, whatever, and the cicadas never stopped, right? So they don't stop because they can't hear me. They can't hear me. And so, I'm thinking to myself, this has to have an impact on them, constantly chirping away all of the time. Mm-hmm. This has to have an impact on them in relation to hearing predators. I don't know what it is. I haven't been able to spend months there at a time. It's always been a few weeks a year. So I need to get in there properly, go in there with, a cricket specialist. I'm sure there's a better word for that, to figure out what impact this has. But I've looked at this also in relation to the wind turbines off Barrow and Furness, the Walney Nature Reserve, and the massive reduction in seabirds over the past 10 years. And I mean a massive reduction. Right, so that's a way of listening beyond the human impact. But my more controversial opinion here is, why are we focusing on finding alternative ways to provide energy rather than asking humans to reduce energy consumption?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this is overall my major issue, is why are we putting something all over the planet to feed us the same amount of energy all of the time, rather than saying what we have to do is reduce consumption, right? So in Terra Alta, you have all of these wind turbines, and I'm telling you now, that energy is not being given to the local villages. It's being sent to Tarragona, it's being sent to Barcelona, it's being sent to the major cities, which are pulling all of this energy in the same way that they consume everything else from the rural environments. They're now consuming energy. So that's my kind of probably less politically aware answer.
It's much wider. Yeah.
We love controversy, by the way, and politics. So it's yeah. I just wanted to pick up on this because it reminded me of a law that actually French Parliament passed a couple of months ago in January about protecting what they called sensory heritage of their rural areas. And in that case, specifically, it was triggered by a legal battle around a rooster, something more trivial in a way. But do you think we should be thinking about this kind of regulatory frameworks where you have this kind of legislation in place to protect the sensory heritage of these villages and areas?
Yeah, I think the sensory heritage is an interesting one. I think this is again where I become quite controversial as a sound artist when I say that for me it's listening to a space that allows you to understand how sound impacts on other kinds of heritages as well, right? So for me, hearing the turbines allows me to understand the environment in a more holistic way. So I'm hearing the reduction of culture and employment. I'm hearing the consumption of energy as people go into cities, and that's where people are moving towards, is the city, and requiring air conditioning units and everything they need to survive in a big city. So I don't know about preserving sensory heritage. I think for me it's about, if you listen, it's Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring, right? The first thing that you need to do is listen to the world, because that is going to tell you what's going on. What's wrong here? If I'm starting to hear the world differently as a result of this new technology coming in, then right now I need to question what's going on. And as Rachel Carson said, is that once you start hearing the birds disappear, that's when the problem has started. Once they've gone silent, not when you see the trees have died. It's too late at that point. The trees have died, there's no birds in the sky, the plants have disappeared. It's too late. So for me right now, what we need to do is we listen to the environment, and we'll start to hear the changes that are happening, and we can start to address what is creating the change, and what should we do to transform or challenge that. It's not a good answer to your question, Francesco. I don't think so.
It's perfect. So thank you.
I think your mention about this silent spring brings us nicely into talking about your own sort of sound artwork and your compositions, because you sent us this recent album called Silent Spring, right?
Yeah.
And you can sort of correct me if my interpretation of it here is wrong, but when I was listening to it and thinking about your work that I had just read, in your work, you note that it's impossible for a recording to sort of replicate or capture what a listener actually experiences.
Yeah.
Either the holistic, everything they're experiencing, or the emotion of what you hear when you're in that space. Mm-hmm. And so with these compositions, are you trying to evoke or convey that same sort of emotion that you felt in the space in a way which can't be conveyed by the recording itself?
Yeah, I think what these sound artworks for me is an expression of my feelings about the situation. Trying to capture the sense of both beauty for the environment and fear of what is happening to it. So it's my way of, it's another way for me to speak about it, to speak about how I'm feeling about it. So when I write about it, it's probably possibly more clinical, slightly more objective, because I'm talking about how I'm capturing data from different people. I try to be slightly removed from the ideas that I'm exploring. But I feel a fear all of the time about what is happening to our environment. And I feel the beauty of our soundscape. And as an artist, I want to find a way to express that aesthetically, to try and evoke a kind of emotion that replicates how I feel, whether it's someone hears the sound and thinks, wow, that's beautiful, and simultaneously harsh or difficult to listen to. And in that way, it's another way of saying, this is how I'm perceiving the world right now. And I'm using this medium to express that.
I was listening to the Icelandic Reveries, I think was the title. Excuse me if I got it wrong. Yeah. I read it in your paper about your experience of going down into this hydroelectric dam and hearing the low frequency and these beating and all that. And after an hour, not being feeling nauseous and not being able to stand there anymore.
And using the contact mics.
Yeah.
Well, the contact mics could not pick up that sensation. Yeah. They really couldn't.
But in the composition itself, the way that you put all these sounds together, like, to me, it was very uncomfortable listening to it. I don't know if that's what you were trying to intend, but that was the sort of the emotion that I felt listening to it, was this sort of uncomfortableness with the sound.
Yeah. Well, again, for me, what I found really interesting about those dams was that there is this sense that you build this thing underground, and so therefore it's invisible. So in the environment, isn't that okay, right? Because we don't see it, so therefore visually it's not a problem. We are being environmentally friendly because you don't see this big ugly thing in the environment, and we're harnessing water. It's down and it's out of the way. And I'm thinking, okay, but what about everything that lives down here under the ground and in the water? Who has to hear this all of the time? And so the work for me was trying to replicate that experience. But again, I think perhaps because in some way there is a human-centric approach to the things we put in space. It's the focus is for us, right? So on the one hand, we can say, oh, this renewable energy technology is really great because it isn't burning coal and it isn't pulling oil out of the ground. And I agree, that is better. There's been wars fought over fossil fuel, and for nearly 2 centuries we've been polluting the earth with it. Absolutely. But again, I just think there needs to be a deeper question about why we need so much energy and where does it stop. I mean, I have this vision of the planet completely encircled so much with wind turbines and solar panels and hydroelectric dams and hydrokinetic turbines that we eventually float off course. I know it's a ridiculous science fiction notion, but we are building another thing to solve our needs and problems. And it is noisy. It's noisy in different ways. Okay, it's not as harmful as coal burning in the air. Again, I get that. But if we're looking always to technology to solve technological problems and not thinking more holistically about the environment. And I think listening is a way to do that, is to go into the environment and pay attention to the soundscape, because we're not the only thing here.
But this brings me to another thing related to your sound artwork, which is always based on actual recordings, but also digital manipulation of them. And how do you approach this border when you start to really base things on how they were exactly captured in space, and how do you then decide, okay, now I need something else, I need to manipulate with those sounds or add new ones?
Yeah, I guess it's probably always a different answer depending on the work itself, but generally speaking, I do usually start with acoustic recordings, field recordings, probably because the idea starts with something that's happening in space or a listening experience. So field recording is usually the beginning of the process, because I'm usually engaging with the field, whatever the field is, whether it's the natural world or the urban, or something private, something in the home, something in the head. I start with the field recording, and then anything that I add to it is about how to best tell the story, whatever the story is. Am I trying to elevate or amplify an emotional experience? And I can do that through electronics and through sound design. Am I trying to make something that is said more discreet, so I'll disturb it slightly? Or am I trying to say something about the sound itself having an emotional awareness, so I have to manipulate it in some way to give it some sense of autonomy, that it has a voice. So that's how it can work.
The Silent Spring piece is very much like that. I would say it starts with this very narrow, very specific sound of cicadas, and then it just grows like a. And the sound it ends with, it reminds me of turbines. But are there turbines, or it's something manipulated?
No, there are turbines. Yeah, there are turbines. I think Silent Spring was very much about trying to capture both delicate, intangible, ephemeral sounds, semi-fixed community people sounds, and then this technological soundscape. So I was trying to capture all of the things that I've heard for years, and then interlace them and have some become more overbearing than others at times, to say this sound is now more in the environment than the others, and it masks it, and this sound has now become invisible and it disappears. There's only traces of it left, and so that was sort of the process. In all honesty, I haven't listened to it in a while, so I can't speak to it in too much detail, but yeah, that was sort of the process of working with it.
Linda, this was great. I have a very final question, and now this is a question for the head of department, actually. So there is this concept about listening as practice, which I felt was on the background during all this conversation and this kind of approach. And of course, we need more of that. So the question for you is, how do you think we can teach that? How do you teach to listen as practice?
Well, that's interesting because on Wednesday and Thursday morning, I did a 2-day workshop for the Walking Festival of Sound on listening as practice. And I have to say, doing that online was unique.
It's a special challenge.
Really unique. It really was a special challenge. But I have been teaching listening as practice for years now. And I go around the world bringing people, talking to them about listening, the difference between passive and active, talking to them about Pauline Oliveras, who is the great founder of deep listening, the deep listening movement. But then I kind of put my own edge on it, my own copyright, which is thinking of a particular methodology that aligns with certain social theory practice about engaging with and listening to communities as well as the natural environment. So kind of cross-disciplinary approaches to connecting ecological listening with social and cultural listening, and how, in a sense, we need to listen to all parts of our environment to understand how they communicate with each other, both the human, man-made, and the natural, ecological. So I have been teaching it for years, and I have developed courses in it. And then there's also, when you have this data, what do you do with it? Because there's listening as part of the process, but what comes next? How do you identify tangibly what has emerged from that listening experience? And sound mapping has been the next process that I've explored with people in teaching and workshops. So think about how we can map that experience, whether it's on paper, 3-dimensionally, in conversation. And then after that, what do you do with that information? All right, who are you? Why are you listening? And then, so what will you do after your listening experience? So I've worked with people who work in sound design for film, biologists, marine biologists, people who work in ecology and environmental studies, a whole range. And so it's a case of, right, so this is a method or a methodology. I've taught it to you. How can you apply it in the field of research that you do? Including artists, how can you apply it in a performance setting, an installation, whatever? I don't know. Did that answer the question?
Perfectly. Thank you so much.
I think that's a good place for us to go and end it. I'm just going to ask a final thing, which is, so we're going to put a link to, I guess, to the SoundCloud with Silent Spring and all that in the description of the episode. Is there any other sort of project that you're involved with that you sort of want to say something about and plug a little bit?
Oh, yeah, actually, God, let me see which one. So, well, it's a funny one. I've just in January received Creative Scotland funding, and talk about out of the ballpark here. This is left field for me ever so slightly. Okay, hugely, somehow related, but still. It's called Evolving Ourselves with Unnatural Selection. And it's focusing on gene editing technology and data sonification. And so there is a facet of this research that is looking at how we can potentially transform our biological selves and the biology of our world, including plants and animals as well as humans, and the impact this may have in the future on our entire global ecosystem. So sound is a big feature of it, but also gaming and visuals and so on. So I'm working with different partners in science and research from different universities, and we're going to be working with different communities on focus groups, exploring gene editing technology. So it's a bit of a jump for me in practice, but this started in January. As I said, there's going to be a lot of different things coming out of it in the latter half of this year. So watch out for that.
We will.
That sounds super exciting. Very interesting. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. As I said, anybody who wants to take a listen to Silent Spring, go ahead and check out links in the description. So Linda, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, you're really welcome. It was great fun chatting.
And cut.
Yeah, I just wanted to the tiny thing about the Casio synth you mentioned. Was it the very small white one?
The rest is just
noise. Oh, but small black one. The little small black one that was about this size, which was obviously really big for my 7-year-old.
Noise.
Okay.
Noise is just noise.
It's just noise.
You can find episodes of The Rest is Just Noise on all of your usual podcast apps.
And on our website at justnoisepod.com. We're also on Twitter as @justnoisepod.
The Rest is Just Noise is supported by the UK Acoustics Network.